Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam Pajami Gurumishwaram Itam Shri Radhika Prana Nata Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutya Shadhattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitam Purna Prema Rasutsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payura Shomura Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Mudna Nipatyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhutanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Vairagya Yug Bhakti Rasam Prayatnai Rapayayan Mam Anubhipsu Mandham Kripam Budhirya Paraduka Duki Sanatanam Tam Prabhumashrayami Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Chetasam Me Chittam Satam Marukari Yatu Pada Padme Bhaktir Ya Nakilarta Varga Janani Ya Brahma Sakshat Kriter Anandat Dishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Padam Bujayugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Ya Karya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Prem Naiva Tasyai Namah. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Mahasagar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad, the foremost of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, Shri Sanatana Gosvamipada. Again today we will continue our discussion of Saranagati in Hari-bhakti-vilasa as a subset of our discussion of the Sanatana Shiksha in Sri Caitanya-caritamrta, where we've now come to the Prakaran on Saranagati. So today we'll conclude the section on the greatness of Saranagati, the Mahatmya, and we'll come to perhaps the most practical and significant section of this Prakaran, those of the Lakshanas, or the specific characteristics of what Saranagati is, in other words, how it can be practiced. So, Sanatana Pad ends on a sweet note here in his Mahatmya section with the following statement of Bhagavan Sri Krishna himself in the Uddhava Gita. Ate Bhoktam Sri Bhagavantam Prati Uddhavena. A statement of Uddhava to Sri Krishna in the Uddhava Gita. So he says, Tapatraina bihitasya gore santapyamanasya bhavadhanisha pashyami nanyatcharanam tavangri tvandata padrad amrita bhivarshat. O Isha, for one beset with and thus being seared by the three miseries on the frightful path of material existence, I do not see any shelter other than the nectar-showering umbrella of your 2 feet. So the sense here, the metaphor that's being evoked, is a person walking through a desert or walking through a difficult to traverse area under the hot sun. So the word tapatraya, or what is sometimes in English called the three miseries or the three sufferings of material existence, the word tapa certainly means that, but its etymological sense is heat or burning. So just as being burned causes pain, so the word burning is in Sanskrit effectively synonymous with pain. So by choosing this particular word, if we just translate it according to its most conventional sense of misery, a little bit of the metaphoric intent of the verse is lost. So what he wants to evoke is that when a person is suffering from these three heats, or these three, high intensity heats, causes of heat that cause pain, namely these three types of suffering in material existence, which is like a path someone is walking through along under the very hot sun, then he says, I don't see any shelter other than the nectar showering umbrella of your feet. In other words, just as someone trying to make such a journey won't find any protection or won't find any relief on such a journey unless they have an umbrella that they can carry, I can at least say for myself, it wasn't until I spent summers in India that I understood that umbrellas were more useful to protect you from the sun than they were from the rain. Or in other words, I'd only ever used umbrellas for the rain, and then sometimes I would go out in the summer and other people would say, do you have your umbrella? And I'd think, what? It's a blazing hot sunny day. And then I realized, oh, that's why you need an umbrella actually. So, however, as nice as it is to have one of your classic black Indian umbrellas to go out on an Indian summer day, I've never seen any such umbrella that has a built-in nectar mist showering device. So this is a little bit of an ornament of contradiction in the verse, as he describes this umbrella of Bhagavan's feet as, quote, nectar showering. So normally we think of an umbrella as something that protects you from showers, but now he's sort of twisting the metaphor and saying it's as if you're carrying the umbrella to protect you from the sun or the heat, and then inside it showers or it mists down some nectar on you. So not only does it block the sun, but it also supplies some rich, nourishing, relieving substance or nectar. So something perhaps beyond what we might expect in the conventional sense, and then that thus creates a sense of wonder or a sense of further adoration for the object being described, namely Bhagavan's feet and the shelter that they provide. So just a little bit on the metaphoric sense of the verse. The Sanatana doesn't go into that aspect of it in the commentary here, so I just thought I would add that bit. So the Dig-darsani tika is as follows: Tapatrayena bitasya ata santapyamanasya. One beset with the three miseries or heats, and thus being seared thereby is the sense. Angridvandam eva atapatram tasmat nekevalam atapatrat. Kintu amritam paramananda rasam api abito varshati yat tasmat. So, I do not see any shelter other than your 2 feet, which are verily an umbrella. And not only an umbrella, but one from which amrita, or nectar, so what does he mean by nectar here? Even the rasa of the highest bliss showers in all directions. In this way, Saranagata's release from all suffering and attainment of happiness is stated. So this last point is very significant conceptually or in terms of analysis. For those who've gone through the course on the Priti Sandarbha, they'll recall that in the very beginning of the text, in the very first statement of the first Anucheda, Jiva Goswami says that the fundamental purushartha, or the fundamental aim of every embodied being, is twofold. It is the relief from suffering and the attainment of satisfaction, or happiness. And this is, analyzed in detail in Nyaya and other darshanas. It's also discussed throughout the Puranas and made pointedly in the Bhagavatam, that whatever someone does, it's fundamentally for this purpose, whatever it may be, whatever color it may take, whatever cultural, philosophical, or personal dress it may assume. Essentially, everyone's doing the same thing. They're trying to relieve themselves of suffering, and they're trying to feel satisfaction. So, for anything to qualify as useful, it needs to be conducive to this aim. This is the fundamental analysis, or the practical look at all human endeavors. If you perform an action, but it doesn't result in reducing your suffering or in producing your satisfaction, then what good is that action? It was a waste of energy, a waste of time. So, Jiva Goswami, his reasoning then is that Priti for Bhagavan is the prayojana, or is the aim that ought to be attained, because it's only in Priti for Bhagavan that the dispellation of suffering and the attainment of satisfaction are absolute. In other words, it's not that we want this prayojan just a little and that'll do, but rather we want this as far as possible. We want it in the absolute sense. So because nothing other than Priti for Bhagavan can accomplish that, nothing other than Priti for Bhagavan will be accepted as the prayojana. This is his analysis in the Priti Sandarbha. So what's noticeable here is that Sanatana is saying that Sharanagatas are said or implied here by this verse and by this section as a whole to achieve those two very things: to become freed from all suffering and to achieve satisfaction. So, what does that imply? That Sharanagati, the principal characteristic of the Sharanagata, their Sharanagati, is itself something that can accomplish the fundamental purushartha, or the fundamental need or drive of every embodied being. Which is to say that Sharanagati then is sufficient to be accepted as the worthy aim, or the worthy object for which whatever one can do. Because if one can achieve that, one can achieve what is meant to be achieved by all activities. So if we remember earlier on in this whole prakaran on Sharanagati, after giving the introduction to it, Sanatana explained its nityata, or its compulsoriness. Why is Sharanagati important? Why is it essential? And he established that by what's called Byatirek, or a negative assertion, where he cited verses to demonstrate, for those who remember from the first reading, that because one will perpetually suffer unless one becomes a Sharanagati is compulsory. So at that point, he doesn't mention the idea of Sharanagati leading to happiness or leading to a positive end, but he explains that without it, you'll never get freed from the negative pole, if you will. Therefore, it's compulsory. So what's very noteworthy is that here, as he's concluding this whole section on the Mahatmya, he also cites this verse, and he draws out this import from this idea of Bhagavan's feet, or the shelter of his feet, being nectar showering, that they produce what he calls the Paramananda Rasa, or this experience of the highest bliss. So it's not then that Sharanagati is compulsory only because it frees you from suffering, or without it you'll perpetually suffer, but in addition, you can say it doesn't just free you from suffering, but rather, in addition, it can lead to the experience of the greatest bliss, or a bliss of the highest order, we might say, because As we see from our Goswami's analysis, Saranagati here has been discussed in general, and then there is furthermore Saranagati united with a specific type of bhava in relation to Bhagavan, and that can achieve, or that can lead to the experience of forms of bliss, of higher orders of excellence. So we don't want to efface the existence of those by speaking of the general category or the concept in general without reference to that as being supreme in the absolute sense, but supreme meaning of certainly no dearth in satisfaction, of the highest order, but nevertheless, with some further potential for specificity and development therein. Anyway, just noting this as far as the whole overall reasoning given here by Sanatana Pad on the subject, we can boil it down in this way, that why be a Saranagata? Because if you don't, you'll perpetually suffer in samsara, and if you do, you'll be freed from an infinity of future suffering in samsara, and moreover, experience bliss of the highest order. So, with this, he concludes his section, and he just writes a concluding verse here, which segues into the next section, of that of the lakshanas, or the characteristics. So he says, Itam cha buddhyam vidvadbhi sharanapati lakshanam bacha hridya tatan cha tanvapi krishnaikashrayanam hiyat. In this way, furthermore, taking shelter solely in Krishna, with one's speech, heart, and even body, is to be understood as a characteristic of Sharanapati, and again, Sharanapati, Saranagati, synonymous, by the wise. So now, although he puts the heading for the section of the Lakshanas after the following verse, he's actually introducing and starting the section with this verse. So, what is then taking shelter in Krishna, or what is Sharanagati? It's taking shelter in Krishna with the body, speech, and mind, or the body, speech, and heart, or thought, word, and deed, which are a classical way in these type of texts to refer to the fullness of all of one's faculties. So, evam mahatmya likhana dvara likitamapi sharanagata lakshanam pritak spashtayan likati itan cheti. Even though the characteristics of a Sharanagata have thus been described by means of the description of the greatness of Sharanapati, that is, even though they have been described throughout the verses in this section on the greatness of Sharanapati, the author now clearly describes them separately. Itam cha, he writes this verse. So in other words, you could extract the lakshanas from the statements that have already been said, but it's convenient if someone clearly extracts them for us and then presents them in a distilled analysis. So that's what this verse is. Anena likita prakarina sakrideva prapanoyas tabasmiti chayachate iti adina vyasadibhi krishna devasya ashrayanam eva yat tadeva sharanagata lakshanam bodhavyam. Taking shelter in Krishna Deva, which is he's just ornamentally saying Krishna, in the manner described by Vyasa and others, beginning with the verse that began this section on the greatness of Saranagati in Hari-bhakti-vilasa 11.653, with this statement of Bhagavan Ram, upon one who takes shelter in me even once and prays, I am yours, I bestow fearlessness forever, is indeed to be understood to be the characteristic of a Sharanagata. So if now we want to say, what does it mean to take shelter? Then he's saying, this is what it means to say, I am yours. So he elaborates slightly, saying, Tatra vacha shrayanam tabasmi iti adi vachanam manasa ashrayanam tasyaivaham iti adi chintanam kayina ashrayanam tat kshetra sevanadi etat cha sarvamagre vyaktam bhavi. So, in that regard, saying, quote, I am yours, is taking shelter by speech. Thinking, I am only his, is taking shelter by mind. Honoring his abode and so on, meaning using the body to honor his abode or serve his bhaktas or perform his worship or what have you, is taking shelter by the body. All of this will be clarified ahead. So, as we began this whole section, he said, Kevalam Bhagavadiyo Yam Etavat Matram, that when he defined Saranagati initially, just this thought or just this conviction, I am Bhagavan's, just that much is Saranagati. So that was how he began. So we can say that if we put together how he began with the statement here, where he's speaking about manasa ashrayanam, or thinking with the mind that, quote, I am his. This is the same thing. So in other words, he defined Saranagati there with the characteristic of Saranagati of taking shelter by mind. But now he's, so to speak, elaborating further and saying, as one takes shelter by the mind, so one may also voice that with the speech and say, I am yours or I am his. And moreover, one may then embody that, or one may then use or act with the body in a way that affirms that, or in a way that is consistent with that. So that's what these lakshanas are in gist. So now he goes into further explanation of the characteristics of Saranagati. Ata Sharanapati Lakshanam. Now the characteristics of Sharanapati, Skande, in the Skanda Puran. Govindam Paramanandam Mukundam Madhusudanam Jaktanyam Vaina Janami Na Bhajami Smaramina Na Namami Na Chastomi Na Pashyami Swachakszusha Na Sprihami Na Gayami Na Vayami Harim Vina. Turning away from Govinda, the highest bliss, Mukunda, Madhusudana, I neither know, nor worship, nor remember anyone else. I neither offer obeisance to, nor praise, nor see with my own eyes, nor desire, nor sing of, nor approach anyone except Hari. So, this is a point that Sanatana gives some important explanation of, and it's a statement that may appear challenging, or, you might hear it and think, oh, how nice, this person is so much focused on Krishna. But then if you think, how is that actually realistically possible? To not know anyone other than him, to not see with the eyes anyone other than him, to not approach or desire anything other than him. Someone might hear these things and say, impossible. I'm sitting here in the middle of samsara. How can I can't see him, and all I see is other things than him. All I desire, all I think about, all I'm busy with are other things. So this is impossible. So we don't want to take it in a way that makes it seem impossible, because that's not the intended sense. Rather, let's see how Sanatana explains this point, to see what is intended by, or what is referred to by this verse. Anyam devantaram tatra bhagavataha pritakatve neti sat sampradayaha. Quote, anyone else means any other devata. So, especially in the Indian cultural context, this is significant, where people are raised with and grow up within an environment in which numerous different devatas are worshipped, and typically there isn't a specified theological demarcation between them, or a sense of hierarchy between them. So it may be very customary from the culture within their family or within their community or their local village or wherever they live to see the worship of all of these devatas. So then, for to come along and say, we only worship this devata and not these ones, it can make people feel very uncomfortable, it can seem strange, it can produce, averse reactions. Are you implying, my family tradition is not right, or my village tradition is not okay? All of these things can arise. So, when we simply say, quote, other, what do we really mean by other? So this is an important point that Sanatana explains. So he says, quote, in this regard, quote, as being separate from Bhagavan is the authentic Sampradaya view. So it's a short statement, but what he means by that is that the view that is legitimately in accord with the Shastra, meaning the intent in this statement is not literally that a Sharanagata does not know of, does not ever worship, or does not ever think of any devata other than Bhagavan, but rather that a Sharanagata does not think of any devata other than Bhagavan, but rather that a Sharanagata does not regard any devata as being separate from Bhagavan. Meaning, a Sharanagata regards all devatas as integral dependent aspects of Bhagavan's non-dual, absolute, all-encompassing majesty, such that even when a Sharanagata sees, worships, or otherwise cognizes another devata, a Sharanagata regards this as only a dependent aspect of Bhagavan, and in that sense to verily be Bhagavan alone. So he, by mentioning the quote, Sat Sampradaya, what he's implying here is that one needs education in how all these different statements are found in the Puranas are meant to be put together into a coherent worldview. You can say a Sampradaya is essentially a coherent reading of a diversity of texts, a way of taking all these different texts and then bringing out a coherent worldview that can be satisfyingly attributed to or satisfyingly grounded in the statements of this canon of scriptures. So what this then means is that he's not promoting a type of fanaticism in which one says this is the devata and this is not, and then there's wars and things, which did happen on the Indian subcontinent for some centuries. There were wars between Vaishnavas and Shaivites and, all these different battles about who is the supreme devata or the only devata or all these things. So from that came this gradual integration or this gradual coordination such that there became a way of seeing them as internally distinct aspects of a broader singularity, and thus not, quote, different or other in an absolute sense, but only in a qualified dependent sense. So that's, in essence, what is referred to, and certainly this is a topic that Jiva Goswami elaborates on in the Sat Sandarbha. The whole structure of the first four Sandarbhas based on the verse Tat Vadanti Tat Tattvavidas Tattvam Yaj Gyanamadvayam, and the Bhagavatam's whole emphasis on this idea of there being an Advaya Gyan Tattva, or a non-dual, absolute, conscious existent, which is the all-encompassing absolute reality. This is the basis for being able to not, quote-unquote, see another, but rather to see always him as the other. So what appears in front of your eyes is the same. In other words, it's not that seeing here refers to literally looking at objects, but that how those objects are perceived or how they are regarded. Are they regarded as being him in a qualified, dependent, secondary form, or are they thought of as something, quote, other than him? So just how one chooses to see these things as integrated, dependent parts rather than, quote, otherness, enables one to cultivate and practice Saranagati throughout all the circumstances that one might encounter in life. And in the modern day, where people might be practicing this path of bhakti, which has its origin in the Indian subcontinent, but be doing so on other continents where there aren't the same cultural trimmings and the same, use of language and imagery and symbology and things like that that's associated with the tradition in their immediate environment, then they need not see those things as entirely other either, meaning they can also see that quote-unquote otherness as also a qualified expression of the very same thing. So to prevent themselves from just merely seeing a bunch of bland otherness and rather seeing, other varieties of hisness or, aspects of him or parts of him or things that need not be conceived as entirely separate from him, then these teachings are highly practical and not merely, theological theory. So since Saranagati is the basis of being accepted by Bhagavan as his bhakta, of actually engaging in any form of bhakti at all, then having this type of vision is what can sustain that spirit of Saranagati within all the situations that we go through in life. So to say that I neither offer obeisance to, nor praise, nor see with my eyes, nor desire, nor sing of, nor approach anyone other than Hari. What he's saying then is that, or as we referred to in a previous discussion, as Jiva Goswami spoke about in Anucheda 106 of the Bhakti Sandarbha, when one can see that every living entity, every particle of the animation is what's called an adishtan, or a dwelling place of the Ishta Devata, of Bhagavan himself, then where am I going but towards him? Who am I in the midst of but him? So by acquiring this type of vision, we have an impetus to honor everything around us, and moreover, we have an impetus to remember him, to enable everything to become a reminder of him rather than a distraction from him. So without this vision, this statement in this verse would be impracticable. So therefore, this type of vision, in other words, this type of education as the Sampradaya has given, or what he says here, Sat Sampradaya, meaning he's not limiting this to, quote, his own Sampradaya. By simply saying Sat Sampradaya, he means there are a plurality of authentic or valuable Sampradayas, and by acquiring a vision that comes from any one of them, one can, so to speak, transcend this quote-unquote otherness or separateness. Okay, so then he makes another statement, which is also a bit brief, but has a broad implication. He says, Govindam ityadi visheshanair mahatmya visheshena tadeka nishtata yukta iti darshitam. So, by means of the qualifiers Govindam and so forth, it is shown that singular fixity in him, namely Bhagavan, is proper on account of the supremacy of his greatness. So, upon whom shall we be fixed? We should be fixed upon he who is supreme, he who has superlative greatness. Otherwise, our investment, so to speak, would be losing an opportunity cost, or in other words, we would be better rewarded having it elsewhere. But when we're in the blessed place that we could be, then our actions, our time, our efforts produce the maximum benefit or result that they could. So his point is that the reader or the person hearing this statement is assured that this type of one-pointed fixity that's described in this verse by saying, I don't see anyone else, I don't praise anyone else, I don't approach anyone else, that is worthwhile, that he's worth having that type of fixity, because to have that type of fixity in something lesser and, God forbid, something that's actually harmful to us will be something that will be ultimately to our detriment. So what he's saying is that this stack of qualifiers given in the verse, where across the first line he's called Govindam Paramanandam Mukundam Madhusudanam, that this list of names is given to give strength to, or to give reasoning for why this long list of then statements about how one is one pointed upon him is made. So Sanatana Pad doesn't elaborate on why these particular names of Bhagavan are chosen, or what aspect of the source of these names brings out that greatness of Bhagavan, but he's implying that they do. So I've made an attempt by reference to other places where all of these names are commented on by Sanatana Pad or Sri Jiva Pad or Sri Chakravarti Pad to indicate, or to, fill in, so to speak, what Sanatana Pad is referring to here. So, Sri Bhagavan's name Govinda indicates his paramount greatness, meaning Bhagavan's paramount greatness, because it describes him as, quote, the possessor of Go. So Vindhatu, most generally speaking, means to possess. So Govinda means the possessor of Go. Now the word Go has a wide range of meaning. That is, the possessor of the senses, the earth, the world, speech, and the Vedas, and as the supremely splendid keeper of the cows of Sri Brajadam. So we hear in the 10th canto how Krishna became known as Govinda after he was honored by Indra and Surabhi following his lifting of Govardhan Hill, and how Indra regarded him as this Indra Gavam, or the prince, or the keeper, the king of the cows, and then this got crunched into the name Govinda. So typically, or principally, in reference to Krishna, the name Govinda can mean that, but the name Govinda is also a name of Vishnu. It's also used generally for Bhagavan, and thus can also convey all these other senses that the word Go does. Can mean possessor of the senses, of the earth, of the world, of speech, the Vedas, so one who's either expert or replete with, or the master of, or the bestower of, all of those things. Bhagavan's name Paramananda indicates his paramount greatness because it describes him as the source and experiencer of the highest bliss, which we'll take it, and I've given some slanted interpretation here towards the Braja Bhakti that we know is the cherished object of our Sri Sanatana Pad, the author. So the highest bliss, meaning the bliss of Sri Brajadam, which is greater than that found in Samsara, in Brahman, and even in Vaikuntha. Bhagavan's name Mukunda indicates his paramount greatness because it describes him as he whose face resembles jasmine. So one way the word Mukunda is broken up is Mu-kunda. Mu meaning muk, face, and kunda meaning kunda flowers, or jasmine flowers. At least in modern day Bengali, one of the common words for jasmine, one of the common varieties of jasmine that you'll see in local towns and villages, is called kundaful. So, Mukunda can mean he whose face is like or exceeds the beauty of a kunda flower. Or, there's a different way the name Mukunda is broken up, as the bestower of mukti. So ultimately, instead of breaking it mu and kunda, you can break it as mukun and da. So da can mean data, or a giver, and then mukun is taken to mean mukti. So mukunda means mukti data, the giver of mukti. Or, as you'll find Chakravarti Pad, and I believe either Jiva Goswami or Sanatana Goswami, one of the two, in one of the Vaishnava Toshanis, also gives a third interpretation as the giver of prema that makes even mukti undesirable. So this is a clever twist on the idea, because the word ku can also mean some kutsit, which means something contemptible or undesirable or fit to be rejected. So then it becomes a triple compound. Mu, ku, da. In other words, which gives that which makes mu, mukti, ku, kutsit. So what makes mukti even undesirable or despicable? In other words, he who gives prema, or this thing that causes such bliss that one belittles or is no longer interested in even mukti. So, to describe Bhagavan as Mukunda in these three ways also further makes known why he's most worthy of being the object of one's Saranagati. And finally, Bhagavan's name Madhusudan indicates his paramount greatness because it describes him as the destroyer of bondage and samsara and as a relisher of the ultimate nectar, the prema of the people of Sri Brajadam. So the word, my gosh, there's a typo. Sorry, Madhusudana, that needs to be fixed. So the name Madhusudana, Sudana can mean a destroyer, and in some cases the word Madhu is interpreted to mean samsara, or to mean quote unquote sweet, in the delusive sarcastic sense that the world is the fool's paradise. In that sense, it's the thing that one is attached to, or the pleasure, or the sweetness one has. So he who comes and destroys that, it means one who liberates one from samsara. This is one interpretation. And then the other interpretation is that madhu can mean sweet or nectar in the sense of that which is relishable, that which is very pleasurable to partake of. So there's nothing he relishes more than prema. And just as when you say something like devour, you refer to either, eating something quickly, or you can also use it sometimes in the way of referring to something being destroyed. So the word sudana has that same sort of straddles those different semantic zones where it can mean destroyer, but it can also mean destroyer in the sense of consumer. So Madhusudan can also mean like a nectar devourer, so to speak, or in other words, someone who greatly relishes prema, who is greatly attached to and very fond of consuming in ample or unlimited amounts the prema of the people of Braja. So anyway, all of these different, I haven't given footnotes to this, but all of these different points are made in different places in the various commentaries. If anyone's interested in the details, they can look it up on the Anushilan site. I think I have all the citations there. So anyway, Sanatan's point here is simply that all of these names should be understood to underscore his worthiness of being the shelter of Sharanagatas, of being endowed with superlative Mahatmya. So that was why we went on that track. So lastly he says, Evam sarvata tadeka shrayanam sharanagata lakshanam iti abhibhyanjitam tadprakarischa darshita. In this way, taking shelter solely in him in all respects is indicated to be a characteristic of a Sharanagata. The manner therein, meaning of how one takes shelter solely in him, is also shown. So this is the little tiny statement that's also very significant. So in other words, how do you actually become a Sharanagata? How do you take shelter in Bhagavan? This is how you do it. In other words, it's voiced in the sense of negation by saying, we see no other, we praise no other, we approach no other, we desire no other. So what does that effectively mean? That we always remember him, we think only of him, we praise only him, we desire only him, we approach only him. So, in other words, to quote, take shelter in him is not just in a lighthearted manner, or, like a refugee hanging out in some refugee camp doing whatever they like, or, talking about whatever they want and however they are, and they just happen to be sheltered in this place, not like that, rather, but, to say, that the object that my mind will remain absorbed in, the object that I shall desire, that which I will speak about, which I will hear about, as far as possible, directly or indirectly, will be he and he alone. Excuse me. And just because it's a topic we've been discussing recently elsewhere, to say here, to include in this list desire, to say that I desire nothing other than him, this also shows the scope of how Saranagati is conceived, because Jiva Goswami explains in his commentary on Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu that the principal characteristic of Bhava Bhakti is desirousness solely of Bhagavan, tadeka sprihatvam eva. So, to say or to reach this state of desiring nothing other than him would be to be in a state of desiring only him, which would fit the definition of what Jiva Goswami calls Bhava Bhakti. So, this is also significant to a point that Jiva Goswami makes later in his discussion of Saranagati in the Bhakti Sandarbha, and can also be considered to be hinted at by Rupa Goswami in the Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu when he speaks of Saranagati among the angas of sadhana bhakti, and he refers to not just Sharanapati but Sarvata Sharanapati, or Sharanapati in all respects. So one way that can mean in body, in mind, in words, like that. But in another broader, perhaps more abstracted sense, it can be taken to mean that Sharanagati pervades the entirety of one's trajectory. In other words, Jiva Goswami explains one can't even take up sadhana bhakti without any fundamental degree of Sharanagati, and that even in the state of Bhava Bhakti, it's not that one is any less a Sharanagata. Rather, the intensity of the Sharanagati is only more vividly, more sweetly expressed in the higher stages of Bhava Bhakti and Prema Bhakti. And moreover, even as there's a gradation in different types of Bhava or Rati in relation to Bhagavan, of Dasya, of Sakya, there also the Sharanagati becomes more and more pronounced, or more and more specific. So in all respects, Sharanagati is fundamental to everything else and pervades the entirety of all further expressions of bhakti. So, what Sanatana is saying here by just saying tat prakaras chadarshita, that the manner of being a Sharanagata is also shown here, this is a very big statement. In other words, really that is true, and what is described here is a fit way of describing, all of Bhagavan's parikaras, all of, the great bhaktas that we hear about, and, shows fundamentally the depth of what is aspired for by people who take up this path. Okay, so I'll just read it one more time just to summarize because it's significant. Turning away from Govinda, the highest bliss, Mukunda, Madhusudana, I neither know nor worship nor remember anyone else. I neither offer obeisance to, nor praise, nor see with my own eyes, nor desire, nor sing of, nor approach anyone except you. Alright, then we'll go for one more short one here. Kechirahuscha sharanagatatvam shat prakarakam praya sakya prakare tat paryavasyat vicharataha. Some have also said that being a Sharanagata is sixfold in manner, and that analytically in general it shall amount to, meaning can be considered equivalent to, the manner of bhakti known as sakya, or friendship. So, tatra matantaram likati ke chit. In this regard, the author describes another view, meaning he writes this verse. Sakya rupo ya eko bhakte prakaras tasmin tad shat prakarakam sharanagatatum vicharitaha paryavasyat. Totcha agre abhibhyanja jaitavyam. It, meaning being a Sharanagata, which is sixfold in manner, analytically shall amount to, that is, be considered equivalent to, that manner of bhakti the form of which is Sakhya, or friendship. That is, some are of the view that Sharanagati can be categorized as being a part of the limb of bhakti known as Sakhya. That, furthermore, is also to be indicated ahead. So what's interesting here is that Sanatana Goswami refers to this sixfold analysis of the characteristics of Sharanagati as what some say. So what he's indicating is that that's not entirely his viewpoint. So in the Bhakti Sandarbha, Jiva Goswami expresses this viewpoint referring to these six limbs and the verse that defines them, which is the next verse cited here in this prakaran. And similarly in the Caitanya-caritamrta, which we'll get to shortly, Sriman Mahaprabhu in his teachings to Sanatana Goswami also speaks about or explains Sharanagati with reference to this verse explaining these six limbs. So the fact that here Sanatana Goswami expresses a little bit of, not in any way dismissal, but of a little bit of a qualified sense of distinction between that and what he's just described, is a much lesser, at least in my experience, is a lesser, less frequently discussed understanding. Or in other words, that Sharanagati can be satisfyingly understood even without reference to these six limbs, and that as it's been described already here, that just having that conviction, I am his, and just seeing no other, hearing no other, approaching no other, have no conception of anything other than him, that itself can fully encapsulate and be a complete and satisfying concept of what Sharanagati is. That I belong to him, and there is nothing other than him for me to conceive, for me to desire, for me to praise, or what have you. That aspect of things sometimes is, that side or that viewpoint about Sharanagati is perhaps less clearly or less vividly understood when everything is discussed through the lens of these six limbs. So I don't mean to in any way, say that this other verse or the way it's given in the Sandarbhas and the Charitamrita and otherwise is in any way deficient, but just that this additional insight or this additional emphasis that you get here, and this is something unique to this prakaran here in Hari-bhakti-vilasa, and at least in my personal view, it's something very profound. It's something very also enriching to our understanding of what to cherish in regard to this subject. So in the analysis that he gives in the next commentary, he goes into more detail about what he said right here, why some people consider Sharanagati just a subpart of what's called Sakhya. He analyzes that ahead, so I won't elaborate on that now. We'll just get to his explanation of it next. So I think I'll stop here, and in our next reading we can look at these six limbs of Sharanagati, we can look at how Sanatana Pad glosses them, and then how he writes a very excellent summarizing verse on the whole topic, and then ends the prakaran with a couple of other very prominent verses from the Bhagavatam on the subject. So most likely we'll conclude our sub-series on this prakaran in our next reading. So if anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or any feedback otherwise, please feel free to share. Yes, Vidyiji, I see your hand.
Yes, my pranam to you. Thank you. Sharanagati Jai.
Jai.
So far, we've been thought that the six limbs of Sharanagati are the only way. And of course, it's not just the way, it's the whole concept of life. Now we hear that Sharanagati is someone who, and please correct me, Sharanagati is someone who considers, it's basically a state of the mind by which one considers Bhagavan as only reality, and being himself being what I have to say is that he doesn't see any other, but doesn't mean that that person is a Kanta Bhakta immediately.
Sorry, did you say akanta?
Akanta meaning like someone who is one pointedly focused on Bhagavan, and a Kanta Bhakta. Yes, it's the one who is single-pointedly focused on object of his attainment. Is that the statement of Sharanagata according to the definition you elaborated on?
Sure, we can say that. I mean, as we discussed in the opening reading, his initial definition is Bhagavadiyo Ham, that I belong to Bhagavan.
I belong to Bhagavan.
This much, that is Sharanagati. So then what we got today is this verse which indicates further that I belong to him and there's nothing other than him, and he is the absolute whole, that outside of which or separate from which I neither know anything, nor pursue anything, nor see anything, nor desire anything, nor praise anything, etc. So if we boil all that down, my 2 cents would be that you could crunch the idea to I belong to him and he is the absolute, and he is the ultimate reality.
Okay. So
then to get to your second point, so throughout Hari-bhakti-vilasa, Sanatana Goswami uses the word akanti as a theme to refer to bhaktas other than those who would be equivalent to what Rupa Goswami calls Vaidhi bhaktas, or persons who are simply following injunctions of the Shastra with a sense of obligation to do so. So, when he speaks about ekantis in Hari-bhakti-vilasa, there are different ways that he uses the term in different contexts. So, in one context, an ekanti is someone who's reached the state of actually having no desires and actually having no thoughts unrelated to and dedicated to Bhagavan. So in one sense, an ekanti is a Shuddha Bhakta or a Bhava Bhakta. In a broader sense, an ekanti is one who has embraced the ideal of becoming that. In other words, one who's become acquainted with these teachings and says, I want to follow the path of reaching a state of ekantik bhakti. So, just as someone following the path of Shuddha Bhakti is in some contexts in the Goswami's works spoken of as a Shuddha Bhakta. Not in the sense that they've already become Shuddha, but in the sense that they're a follower of the path of Shuddha Bhakti.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, according to context, the word akanti can convey either sense.
Mm-hmm.
And here what we can say is that in that opening statement of the text, of this Prakaran rather, Sanatana Goswami is saying that Sharanagati is something that can be done even by the people who can't do any other kind of bhakti. So he wants to bring out a sense of accessibility, a sense of really, really accessible simplicity. Like, maybe you can't do anything, but this much you can do is just think, I'm his. Even if you can't sing, even if you can't do puja, even if you can't go to the dham, even if you can't do this, that, or anything, you just sit in your house, wherever you are, and just think, I belong to him. This much anybody can do. They don't need any social environment or social anything, physical anything for that. So that's one side of what he's trying to bring out here. And then also, in light of what he's saying today, that's also, in one sense, it's not just a passing thought, but to say, really, I belong to him, is what is the import of that? Then it is to act accordingly. If I really belong to him, then he's the worthy aim of my existence. He's the worthy aim of my speech, of my actions. He's the person that I should please by doing what I do, etc., etc. So then you'll get a gradation in the depth of the expression of that. And that's what comes a little bit later in this prakaran, where after he mentions these lakshanas, then he says, and as much as one engages in this, or as far as one does this, that much they benefit, that much they succeed. So he recognizes this to exist on a 0 to 100 grayscale. Not that you're not a Saranagata unless you're 100% surrendered, but rather, to some extent, if you're trying, then you can be accepted, just as, someone who just bought a new tennis racket and got their first tennis lesson could be called a tennis player. Or, a tennis player is only somebody who qualifies for, a Grand Slam tournament and is some, professional tennis player. It's like, sometimes tennis player means an actual professional tennis player, and sometimes tennis player just means anybody who's ever played tennis. So, something like this. There's room for people to go from, just had my first lesson, even the guys who are pros, there was a day when they were just a guy who had their first tennis lesson.
Yeah. So sometimes he says that one who, actually the Vaishnava is Sharanagata. So there's no question of being a devotee of Krishna or Bhagavan if one he's not, doesn't have this Sharanagata traits. Is that right?
Absolutely. That's a point that comes out very strongly at the conclusion of the Saranagati Prakaran in the Bhakti Sandarbha, where he says, Tadiyatva asiddhe, that without Saranagati, there is no establishment or no accomplishment of belonging to him, or being his own person. And if you're not his own, then there's no question of you being a bhakta. So without Saranagati, bhakti, being a bhakta, is impossible. This is like Jiva Goswami's, master statement at the end of the Saranagati Prakaran, right before the Sadhana Bhakti Prakaran in the Bhakti Sandarbha. And when we get to our discussion in the Caitanya-caritamrta, you see the exact same structure, where the discussion comes to Saranagati, and then after Saranagati starts discussion of the practices of sadhana bhakti. So just as Jiva Goswami structured it, so also Kaviraja Goswami structured it, and we'll definitely come to some pointed discussion of that very important statement when we get to that part of the text soon.
So Sharanagati is like, as we say, it's like fluid area. It's not hardcore defined idea. And also is defined by one's own assessment of one's consciousness. Cannot be assessed by external observation to greater extent, I believe. It's hard to pinpoint, oh, he's Sharanagata, he's not Sharanagata. Only one self can, someone can assess himself or his own or her own Sharanagati commitment or level, and no one else can state it. Can we say that?
Yeah, generally. I mean, Sharanagati or Bhakti, there may be cases, where someone might be seen to doing something ordinary, but actually they're doing it with a very devout mentality. There are, cases of this.
So, I'll let a little bit ponder on this if you have a little bit of time. is that so? Sharanagati is this. Is it? So I understand that Sharanagati lifestyle or mentality is not necessarily, as you say, not Shuddha Bhakta, but someone who is also self-analyzing one's own placement in the ladder or in the area of Vaishnavata. So one who may have even have serious doubts about oneself, be self-critical. I'm not ready. Do I really want it? Do I really want bhakti? Am I really that? Despite of my life being committed or living within the concept of Krishna consciousness, still the undertone thought is: am I really a Vaishnava? Am I really committed? Am I really a Sharanagata? And that kind of gray, tatashta kind of conditioning of self-doubt would be also part of Sharanagati. And at the same time, let me finish. At the same time, once upon self-analysis, one thinks, well, where do I go? That Bhagavan is the only reality. I cannot commit. Perhaps I have no qualification for bhakti. My desires are all over. But at the same time, where do I go? It's a kind of catch, like that's I want him, but do I really want him? Do I really qualified for this path? This kind of contemplation. So meaning that he's on the path, and he may consider, oh, maybe I should do something else, but he cannot do it. He's like kind of stuck in this kind of gray, twilight zone. Yet seeing that, well, that's the only reality I have, but I'm not pure devotee, definitely not. Is that part of Sharanagati? That's kind of contemplation. If you understand what I'm saying.
Could be. I mean, or bhakti in general, or shraddha in general. I mean, Sharanagati, as we heard, is the characteristic of shraddha. To the extent that there is shraddha, there is clarity about the stuff that you're talking about. So, to acquire that clarity, there has to be introspection, there has to be self-analysis, and so in the process of what's called manana, or contemplation or reflection upon the teachings, then many such questions and many such reflections will come about. And it's natural, if one acquires a clear idea of what bhakti is, what Sharanagati is, what a deep thing it is, that one may also feel it to be, gulp, like deep waters, or not so easy. Sometimes there can be a lot of confidence about things, which is a product of having a shallow concept of what they actually are. So
exactly.
Once someone gets acquainted with the depth of what's really being talked about, then that they will experience self-doubt or confusion or uncertainty or a lack of resolve. These are all, in a sense, natural to, going through the process, and gradually, by doing that, an internal contemplation and continuing to hear and to refine one's understanding, and ideally to also have a lifestyle that supports the purification of the citta and gives one the chance to experience the satisfaction and the joy and the beauty of what's there in the path of bhakti, so that it's not just a bunch of hacking a bunch of theory, but there's also a richness of experience that will support the conviction that one has. Then things will gradually solidify. Gradually the shraddha will become driddha, and with that firming of the shraddha will come more and more of the linga, or more and more of the indicator the expression, which is Saranagati, as per Jiva Goswami's analysis. So when one has that Shraddha, then one more and more, one's behavior, one's conduct, one's thoughts will come in alignment with it. So, there's no point in making a show to anybody else, there's no point in trying to force it or rush it, but in one's own time, to the best of one's own sincerity, one, has the blessed opportunity to try to progress along that path, should they feel the inclination to do so, should they, have such inspiration.
Thank you. And this leads me to another point. To tell people that this part of bhakti is easy, just do it. Does it? What value does it have, really, in the context of what we are learning right now?
Well, if nobody had told you that, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah, it's true.
If you start explaining too many things, too complicated, too deep, too soon, people just, it's too much, and just run away. So, sing, chant, be happy, have fun, just let it be simple for a particular period of time. It has its pros, it has its cons.
It's kind of transcendental feeling outside. Thank you so much. This is a very interesting topic, personally. And I wish we could just have more of this. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your sincere thoughts and reflections. All right. Well then, I think we're good for today. So we'll conclude here, and likely in our next reading, we will conclude I hope, we'll see how far we get, but we should come near the end, if not to the end, of this Prakaran on Saranagati in Hari-bhakti-vilasa. So, Vaishnavibhyo Namo Namo. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai, Radhe Shyam.